You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 11th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
The results of the voting is as follows. 14 votes in favor, 0 votes against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted.
The United Nations Security Council approves a US-backed resolution calling for a full and complete ceasefire in Gaza. We'll look at what the Security Council's move might change on the ground. After that,
of course, Ukrainians will have to take the majority of responsibility for the reconstruction. It has to be done in close partnership with the private sector, both Ukrainian companies but also Western companies.
We head to Berlin, where Volodymyr Zelensky is attending a Ukraine reconstruction conference ahead of his own peace summit in Switzerland later this week. We'll also look in on Slovakia's efforts to overhaul its public broadcaster. We check in on a summit of NATO's eastern flank members, and we get the latest fashion news ahead of a busy week with Monocle's own Natalie Theodosi. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. For more than a week now, the United States has been insisting that there is a workable ceasefire plan for Gaza in place that both Israel and Hamas should accept. Last night, it persuaded the UN Security Council to back that plan in a resolution that calls for a full and complete ceasefire and the return of hostages. Well, Greg Karlstrom, Middle East correspondent and author of How Long Will Israel Survive the Threat from Within, joins us now on the line. Greg, good to have you back on the show. We did speak last week about how public U.S. President Joe Biden has been with this ceasefire plan. How will the UN's Security Council backing help?
Well, it's symbolic. I'll give it that. I mean, this is the first time in 8 months that the Americans have given this kind of support to a ceasefire resolution at the UN. They tried to pass one once before that didn't make it through because of opposition from other countries. And then they vetoed several proposals early in the war that were meant to call for a ceasefire. So this is the first time they've had this sort of unanimous vote with very strong American backing. They're putting a lot of diplomatic capital behind the ceasefire plan. But I think the morning after this vote, the obstacle to getting the deal done is still the same obstacle that it was a week ago or a month ago, which is this ongoing dispute between Israel and Hamas, this disagreement over whether or not this is going to be a permanent ceasefire or just a temporary release of hostages and prisoners.
Now, as you mentioned there have been multiple efforts before this at the UN Security Council to reach a resolution. This time, as you say, 14 members approved it. China and the US voted in favor. Russia abstained but did not veto. I mean, the Security Council does not agree on much these days, it's fair to say. So is this, I guess, at least a sign that there is an international consensus emerging, even if, as you say, Israel and Hamas still have a lot to work out?
It is. The issue early in the war with those resolutions that America vetoed was that all of those called for sort of an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and a complete end to the war. And this resolution, as we've all been saying for weeks now, this resolution is a bit more vague on the modalities. It's meant to be a three-stage agreement, starting with a release of some hostages and then proceeding to a longer-term end to the conflict, but it's sort of not guaranteed that you get from phase 1 to phase 2. So that is language that the Israelis have been willing to accept, and therefore it's been language that the Americans are willing to accept and not veto. At the Security Council, it's something that Western countries are on board with, and it's something that, I think the most surprising one was Russia not voting in favor, but abstaining. Russia, which is loath to, I think, as you say, go along with anything that's labeled an American initiative at this point. Even the Russians, I think at this point, are okay not obstructing it.
Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East once again. He was in Cairo yesterday pressing Arab nations to convince Hamas to go to back this ceasefire deal. Will they put that kind of pressure on Hamas, do you think?
They will try, but the question is whether they have the sort of leverage over the Hamas leaders who matter, the ones inside of Gaza. I think there was a notable comment from Blinken earlier today when he said sort of the response from the Hamas leadership outside of Gaza has often been fairly encouraging about this deal and previous deals. But he said the voices that really matter are the Hamas voices from inside of Gaza, and we haven't heard a response from them yet. And he's correct about that. There's been some back and forth between Yahya Sinwar, the group's leader in Gaza, and the Egyptian mediators who have been speaking with him. They've had some discussion about the points of this agreement, but there has been no formal yes or no response from the Hamas leadership in Gaza.
Well, and speaking of those sort of internal dynamics on the other side, I mean, Antony Blinken is in Israel today, and there too, the bigger question is these internal dynamics within Israel. I wonder if you could describe at all how Benny Gantz's departure from the Israeli government has affected the calculus for Israel and its Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu.
Well, there are a lot of Israelis who would say his departure from the war cabinet was long overdue, that he should have done this months ago when it became clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu wasn't interested in talking about post-war arrangements, wasn't interested in sort of longer-term strategy for Gaza, and was happy to just let the war drift as it has since the beginning of the year. So Gantz, months later, finally departed the war cabinet. That does not bring down the Israeli government immediately. That would still require at least 5 members of the governing coalition to defect and vote for a no-confidence motion in the Knesset, and there are no signs that the opposition has yet found 5 defectors. So Gantz's departure, for now, all it does is change the decision-making calculus within the government. Netanyahu was trying to balance for the past 8 months between his far-right coalition partners outside of the war cabinet who wanted to continue the war sort of at all costs, and then people like Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, the centrist figures in the war cabinet who are increasingly amenable to making a deal with Hamas and at least temporarily pausing the war. With them out, there is no one now to balance those far-right members of the coalition. It's going to be much harder, I think, for Netanyahu to resist pressure, to spurn diplomacy, and to push ahead with the fighting.
And just very quickly, Greg, at the end, this ceasefire deal may not be the thing that brings down the Israeli government or Benny Gantz's departure, but there is something else, this conscription law moving forward. Can you tell us quickly about what's happening with that this week?
Netanyahu desperately trying to buy for time. He convinced the Knesset yesterday to resurrect a bill from the previous Knesset that would try and resolve this issue of ultra-Orthodox conscription. And it's a bill that would very, very slowly seek to bring them into the army. So it's a bill that the ultra-Orthodox parties felt comfortable voting in favor of, although they'll hope to water it down. Doesn't go nearly far enough for, I think, the majority of Israeli Jews who are furious at this point that they're doing multiple tours of reserve duty. And the ultra-Orthodox are not being called to serve in the military. That is, as you say, I think the most immediate political crisis that Netanyahu will have to get through in the next 2 months before the end of the Knesset summer session.
So many different dynamics to this. Thanks very much, Greg. That was Greg Karlstrom. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The president of Malawi says the wreck of a plane carrying the country's vice president has been found with no survivors. Saulos Chilima and 9 others were flying within the country on Monday morning when their aircraft disappeared from airport radars. It's reported the military aircraft was flying in bad weather. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has pleaded for more air defense help to stop Russian attacks as he began an intense week of diplomatic meetings with Western partners. Mr. Zelensky told a reconstruction conference in Berlin Russia's greatest strategic advantage over Ukraine is superiority in the sky. And Thailand is to connect its national railway with the Laos-China rail network to boost trade among the 3 countries, with expectations that Thailand will act as the region's logistics hub. The official opening of the Thai-Lao rail network is scheduled for next month and will connect Thailand and China by rail for the first time. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Now, as you just heard in the headlines, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Berlin for talks with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and to take part in a 2-day international Ukraine Recovery Conference of 2024 with more than 2,000 participants from 60 countries. The meetings come as Russia has recently intensified its attacks against Ukraine's energy grid, damaging or destroying multiple power plants and forcing the authorities to implement rolling blackouts. Well, earlier my colleague Vincent McAviney spoke to Michael Baranowski. He's a managing director at the German Marshall Fund who is attending the conference. He began by asking what they'll be discussing in Berlin.
Leaders of the West and Ukrainian leadership are meeting today in Berlin to really talk about the next steps of resilience and reconstruction in Ukraine. We are all aware that the war is still going on, but it's critical that we start already talking about how to rebuild Ukraine, starting really as soon as possible. So I hope to see today tangible commitments, tangible plans to begin reconstruction. And that's really the bar for the leaders to address today in Berlin.
Russia has struck a number of targets. It struck hard infrastructure, energy infrastructure, dams, housing, offices. Where do you even go about deciding what you prioritize and how you sequence the reconstruction?
Well, you mentioned energy infrastructure, and that's something very high on the agenda because right now Ukraine is going to face a very difficult fall and especially winter. So that's very high on the agenda in terms of providing also short-term support for Ukraine. The destruction is very wide, and some places might take years to rebuild. At the same time, there are areas of Ukraine that are much safer and much less affected that need to get back to full operation. So, in the end, it will have to be the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people that prioritize. So I cannot give you an answer that we should start with Lviv or we should start with parts of Odessa or Western Ukraine. This is something that the Ukrainian government will have to prioritize, although very important is to also do this in very close partnership with both civil society and the local governments.
In terms of the money and the manpower, where will it come from? And in construction, there is sort of notorious issues with corruption at times. How will that be prevented?
You're asking all the good questions. Corruption is also very high on the agenda in terms of the issues to be addressed and making sure that it's minimized. All countries have problems with corruption, but Ukraine is known for having even more than its fair share, especially before the war. The society in Ukraine is determined not to go back to the bad old habits. So there is societal pressure against corruption. But what has to change is basically a systematic approach to how the reconstruction is done. So it's not something that feathers, but actually is a new positive standard in Ukraine. And that's something that lots of people are thinking about. When it comes to the money, it's very clear that there will have to be one source in addition to Western taxpayer money from European Union, from the UK, from the US. One of the sources will be the Russian assets. Right now, there is a clear agreement on using some of the interests from the Russian assets. There isn't yet agreement to use the Russian assets themselves, even though that would be the really big boost, given that there is 300 billion just laying there in the bank of Russian assets that can be used, and in my view, should be used for Ukrainian reconstruction.
And in terms of the manpower, is it a case of training Ukrainians themselves up and skilling them actually for future labour? Or is it a case where there is simply too much reconstruction and you're going to have to pull in labour from elsewhere?
So skilling people up is going to be critical. There is no question about this. And of course, Ukrainians will have to take the majority of responsibility for the reconstruction. It has to be done in close partnership with the private sector, both Ukrainian companies, but also Western companies. And frankly, this is also a very big opportunity for really a variety of industries. Now, you are also correct to suggest in your question that if this becomes a full-scale reconstruction, and when Ukraine comes back to fully functioning economy, there will be a labor shortage. Numbers that I've talked to with colleagues from Ukraine suggest that because of the migration, because of the people escaping the war, if the Ukrainian economy was in a full swing, there will be a shortage of as many as 5 million people to make this full economy work. So there is also a question and then efforts, conversations about figuring out how to bring back the Ukrainians that had to flee the war back to Ukraine to be part, again, of the society and of the economy. And that's also not the easiest question and easiest issues to solve.
And just finally, President Zelensky is there in Berlin with you today. What's he been saying? Because this conference has kicked off on a bad note. And Mustafa Naim, who was the head of Ukraine's reconstruction agency, has resigned because he says he's been prevented from attending the conference and been undermined from doing his job. So how much are the personal relationships in government going to affect all of this?
There are two aspects. First, President Zelensky certainly will have high expectation that the Ukrainian Recovery Conference in Berlin will deliver on concrete, actionable items. And I've now heard from a number of governments that are saying we'll have some good things to share. And President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is here as well with another important package coming from the EU. So that's one aspect. But what you are mentioning too is that there has been over the last couple weeks, because there is the case of Mr. Naim, but there is also an earlier case of Minister Kubrakov, who was responsible for the reconstruction more broadly, who was replaced as well. And it creates question marks from the Western donor community about the plan, really, of the Ukrainian government, and making sure that the presidential administration doesn't centralize the power too much, that the right people who have been very effective in their jobs are allowed to do their work. In the end, it's of course the decision of the Ukrainian government to decide who runs their ministries and their agencies. But those couple individuals, Mr. Naim and Mr. Kubrakov, have been seen as very, very good, and it does create question marks.
That was Michael Baranowski speaking with Vincent McAviney. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. If there is a playbook for populist governments tending towards the autocratic, it usually includes a move to undermine critical media outlets or take control of the public broadcaster. This is what's happening in Slovakia, where Parliament is debating reforms that would increase politicians' influence over the Slovak broadcaster RTVS. Employees staged a strike on Monday in protest at the reforms that have been championed by Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. Well, Rob Cameron is a journalist in Prague. He joins us now. Rob, first of all, before we actually get to the news about this media reform, Robert Fico himself, of course, survived an assassination attempt. How has he been doing? What has he been saying in the past week?
Well, Robert Fico has made an incredible return to Slovak politics. He appeared in a video that was posted on Facebook, on his Facebook page, just 3 weeks after the assassination attempt. That was apparently posted from his home in Bratislava. He looked very well. He was smartly dressed in a crisp blue and white shirt, and he proceeded really to give a very thorough version of whom he thought was responsible for the assassination attempt against him. He said that this was the fault of the opposition. He also pointed a finger of blame at the West and international organizations for what he said was creating this atmosphere of hatred in Slovakia that allowed this assassination attempt to take place. So he's very much back with a vengeance in Slovak politics. And I think vengeance, at least according to the opposition and his critics, is the word that people are most fearful about.
Well, then, speaking of that vengeance, perhaps that does take us to the topic at hand, which is what the Parliament is debating this week. Tell us about these media reforms.
Yes, well, the government, before the assassination attempt, Fico's government under the Slovak Culture Ministry, which is controlled by politicians who are elected from the Slovak National Party. They're an ultra-nationalist party. They want to abolish the current public broadcaster, which is called Radio and Television of Slovakia, RTVS. They want to abolish that and replace it with a new organization called Slovak TV and Radio under a new director, with changes to how the public broadcaster is staffed and run. The present director, who was elected by Parliament and who should stay in post until 2027, he would lose his job straight away. And as I say, there would be changes to how the board of governors that controls the station would be elected. It would be under much tighter control from the Slovak government. They've backed away from having the power to fire the Director General at will without reason. That's been dropped after protests. But still, the employees and the current Director General of the station are extremely worried about the wording of this bill, which they say goes against not only the principles of the freedom of the media, but also of European Union standards on public broadcasters.
Now, there was a strike by those employees that you speak of on Monday. It was their first ever. Do you imagine that will have any effect? Or you mentioned that perhaps there were some changes to this law as a result of that. But there is also perhaps an argument that, walking away, if the government wants to literally change the name and the organization, that perhaps this is helping them start afresh.
Well, yes, it's a good question. I've spoken to a number of people who work for Slovak radio and TV. And in fact, being a journalist in this part of the world, I have a number of friends who work for Slovak radio. And one of them told me after I'd finished interviewing her about this situation in the station, I asked her, are you going to stay? If these changes are made, and she said, well, I won't, because I've been so prominent in the campaign against the plans to abolish the station. But there are many people, maybe not people on air or behind the microphone, producers and technicians and sound engineers and many members of staff who may think, look, I've got a mortgage, I've got kids, I've got I need to finance my life, so I'm probably not going to walk away from this job at a time of such, financial uncertainty. So many people will really have a dilemma. Do they stay or do they go?
And Rob, tell us a bit more broadly about the Slovakian media landscape, the role that RTVS and others play. To what extent are there sort of independent media outlets, and how much are they coming under fire right now?
Well, they're certainly coming under fire, and that's because apart from the public broadcaster, there are a number of fairly well-known broadcasters, TV stations. Markiza is the most well-known, but Markiza, that's a commercial broadcaster. They're owned by an investment group, and there are also big problems because the sort of flagship political program on Markiza, the presenter said that there were efforts underfoot by the government to exert pressure on the owners to tone down the political coverage and give the government less of more of an easy ride, as it were. And he said that this is one step towards the urbanization of media in Slovakia. They brought him off air and then pulled the program off air as well. And a number of employees in that station as well have also taken strike action and are also extremely worried that station will no longer play the role of the fourth estate and holding the government to account and being the watchdog of democracy in Slovakia. So it's not just the public broadcaster RTVS, it's a number of other broadcasters. And what we're left with are private media, some of the newspapers, which are, fair and critical and objective about the government, an extremely controversial government, which now will find themselves, I think, under increasing pressure. They've already been shut out to a degree because Mr. Fico has, long before the assassination attempt, said that he would no longer be giving interviews to 4 broadcasters, and he named them. And in fact, a number of ministers in his party said, yeah, well, we won't talk to you either. So they're already being shut out from the business of government and no longer able to do their job.
It is quite striking that you mentioned in there the fact that, this sort of urbanization, as you called it. And just finally then on that point, what is the European Union's role there? The European Union has had trouble with Viktor Orban in Hungary as well. Is there something they are going to do about this when it comes to Slovakia? Are there now going to be controls, sanctions, something placed potentially on Slovakia as well?
It's certainly been tabled and suggested. The several European Union commissioners have said, look, if you carry on proceeding with this legislation, not just on the public broadcaster, but other things as well, then there will be consequences for Slovakia. Slovakia will be denied access to those key structural EU funds that it relies upon so heavily. And Mr. Fico, again, before the assassination, said, well, what's happening is that there is a sort of coterie of Slovak opposition politicians, either in Brussels or with contacts to Slovak officials and politicians in Brussels, MEPs and so on, who are basically bad-mouthing Slovakia in Brussels because they don't like my government. So it's a very dangerous point, I think, especially after that attempt on the Prime Minister's life, where people are very worried when he does make a full return to work, perhaps in a month or two, that he will press ahead with these efforts to do exactly what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, bring the public broadcaster under control, make it more difficult for NGOs that are supported from abroad to operate, and just create and continue this deepening polarization that, frankly, Mr. Fico has complained about, but he's done nothing to bring those two sides together.
Rob Cameron, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. For much of the war in Ukraine, it has been the eastern members of the NATO military alliance that have been most outspoken about the need to support Ukraine and stop Russia in its tracks. Today, the so-called Bucharest Nine meet in Riga, in the capital of Latvia, but with one conspicuous absence. The president of Hungary will not be in attendance, and as a result, the Bucharest Nine will not be issuing a joint declaration for the first time since the bloc was founded in 2015. Well, I'm joined now by Richard Plume, international correspondent at Latvian Public Radio. Richard, it's great to have you on the show. Tell us about this summit, first of all. What are the Bucharest Nine going to be discussing?
Yes, thank you for having me. This summit is currently underway in the Riga Palace, and its conclusion is expected in about 2 hours. Yes, of course, the participants of the summit have already made some comments, and the countries will coordinate their positions on various issues related to the upcoming NATO summit in Washington this summer, and so they will try to find a common language regarding various issues, also not about only the alliance, about the NATO alliance and its defense, but also about the questions regarding Ukraine. Of course, a united position could help to convince some maybe skeptical big countries about some issues at the summit in Washington, if we specifically speak about Ukraine, for example.
Well, and then speaking of that common line, what do we know about why Hungary's president is not attending, and how much has that been a topic of this summit?
Well, the president of Latvia, Edgars Rinkēvičs, believes that there is no need to look for any, so to say, public or hidden signals in the absence of the president of Hungary at the summit. I tend to agree with him. Hungary is represented at ambassadorial level here in Riga today. It is hard to say why the president is not here. At least it is not openly stated, but as Rinkevich said, that until the end of the last week, the participation of the Hungarian president in the summit was planned. Apparently, there was some last-minute change here. Of course, we know the history of Hungary's efforts to put various obstacles, both to the expansion of the Nato alliance and the European Union support to Ukraine. And so I see no reason why Hungary should not continue this policy. But Slovakia is also not represented here at the presidential level, and there will be a change of president in Slovakia, so that could be the reason there. And we know that Slovakia has also become more skeptical of Ukraine, at least rhetorically. But despite that, I would not say that Slovakia creates such a problem as Hungary does in the last month.
Well, and as you mentioned a couple of those shifts there, I just wonder then what that means for the Baltic nations, Latvia as well. I mean, the Baltic nations have been the most outspoken, one could say, in this group when it comes to the importance of defending Ukraine. Given some of these shifts, I just wonder how important, how much stock do the Baltic nations now place in the Bucharest Nine? How important a grouping do they consider this to be?
Well, I think we consider it a very important group of countries because we all have common challenges. We all, if we speak about the Baltic countries, of course, and not only about the Baltic countries, about Finland, who joins us here in Riga today, and also other countries on the eastern flank. We share common problems, common threats, not only those threats from the military side, we speak about them, but also about hybrid threats as well. And as the president of Latvia, Edgars Rinkevich, stated this morning that it is essential that Finland and Sweden, which have recently joined the NATO alliance, also participate here today. So we can say that this indicates that the issue of security should not be viewed more broadly. Should be viewed more broadly and cannot be divided in some eastern or northern flank. So in a way, we can say that today in Riga there is a summit of NATO northeastern countries. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg as well emphasized that the alliance is ready and able to defend all allies, including our countries, Baltic states. So he said that in the past years, the alliance has significantly strengthened the common defense system, and we have NATO and Hans forward presence here, also in the Baltic countries. That's very important, and it is being developed and expanded. So I think we have a lot of common questions to discuss here, and this summit is definitely important for us. Also, if we speak about those common positions before the summit in Washington, where we hope to see more strong language regarding Ukraine's accession in NATO.
Richard Plume, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing today. Finally, on today's show, it is time for a fashion news roundup with Monocle's own fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, who joins me right now here in studio. Good afternoon, Natalie.
Good afternoon.
Natalie, we are catching you just ahead of a big Italy swing this week. Tell us about it.
Exactly. So I'm headed to PT Uomo tomorrow, which is Florence's big menswear trade fair, and then on to Milan Men's Fashion Week. So yeah, busy week ahead and a lot going on with men's fashion. So
let's start with PT Uomo. What's happening there? Guest designers and shows. What can you tell us?
So there's always two special shows, runway shows, that are part of the trade fair. And PT always invites two different guests. This season it's going to be Paul Smith, who's traveling from London to Florence to host his show. And then the French designer Marine Serre, very different. Marini is a very experimental, very young, up-and-coming name. And Paul Smith is actually returning to Florence after more than 30 years. He was one of the first to host a show in the Stazione Leopolda there in 1993. So it's really a full circle moment, and I think it's going to be a really joyful, fun show to watch.
What has made him return? What is he expected to put on this time?
So I think it's a big anniversary for him, and PT wanted him to come back. It's also every season that I've been going to PT, there's usually someone, a British talent that they invite over, whether it's a young name like Grace Wales Bonner, or in January they had invited Stephen Stokey Daly, and now they've asked Paul to return. There's always this kind of dialogue between Italian and British fashion. Both countries have such deep-rooted traditions into tailoring, so I think that was the idea behind that invitation, and why wouldn't he want to take it and show in a different location for this season?
We've spoken before about that London link, or the Italian link in London when the Fashion Week was here, but there is also other international presence at this besides the UK. The US and Scandi designers are also doing showcases.
Exactly. So in the bigger fair, there will be dedicated rooms with presentations from different designers, and one of the rooms is called Scandinavian Manifesto. It's been going a few seasons now and getting bigger and bigger. And the idea again is for Scandinavian designers to use the PT platform to promote menswear fashion and what they have to offer. And now the Americans as well are coming, and there will be a showcase of 2 up-and-coming talents, and the CFDA president, which is their organizing body, will be hosting an event to kind of help promote them and show that they are part of the event as well, and then they're here to stay. And it's interesting to see how different nations get involved and use these platforms to promote either their manufacturing, their local talent, and to help them promote their businesses.
It's interesting the way you describe all of this international presence, which I suppose creates a fair amount of hype, and yet at the same time, if I understand correctly, the mood isn't necessarily that positive. There's lower attendance numbers. What's driving that?
I think very slightly lower attendance numbers this season in Florence, and just generally people being more cautious because there have been a number of big retail bankruptcies that we have discussed on this show before. That means that these brands are a little bit wary of selling to wholesale retailers once again, and also they have to be a lot more selective with budgets being cut. So they're choosing between either going to Florence for the PT fair or going to Paris, and a lot of the brands who I've been speaking to at least have said that we've chosen to just do one stop in Paris, which is where kind of everyone goes, and it's the biggest fashion week of them all, rather than kind of try and be in 2 places for the season.
Well, just finally then, speaking of that, tell us about your next moves after Florence. What is coming next in both Milan and Paris?
So I'll be going to Milan with our market editor, Kyoko, and there I think we're going to be looking more for the brands. We were speaking about kind of things being a little bit less stable, but in Milan you can always rely on those heritage big brands to give you new ideas and to host really interesting shows, especially Prada and Fendi. You've got Giorgio Armani, and then we're moving to Paris, where it's a mix. The Fashion Week is really varied. It's the longest one, and there will be really interesting big spectacle shows from Louis Vuitton. Dries Van Noten, the great Belgian designer, will be hosting his last show before he exits the business. But there's also going to be a lot of interesting smaller showcases by Japanese brands, by and a lot of other up-and-coming names flying over for the occasion.
Well, I'm very sure we'll be checking in with you either from Milan or from Paris or somewhere else along many of your trips coming up in the next couple of weeks. Natalie Theodosi, thank you very much for joining us. That is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvinney. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. The briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.